Multiple choice questions covering the concepts of reconciliation and verification. In other words, we're going to look at bank reconciliation, and we're also going to look at our control accounts, as well as trial balance corrections of errors with suspense accounts. Let's take a look at this first one. Jasmine makes purchases from X Limited and also sells goods to X Limited. In other words, Jasmine is both a customer and a supplier. At the year end, Jasmine owes X Limited $500 and X Limited owes Jasmine $750. What are the correct entries in Jasmine's books of accounts to contra or offset these amounts? Well, quite simply, over here you have a situation where one amount is owed and another amount is owing. And the only way that you can really do it in a sensible fashion is you just take the smaller amount, in this case the $500, and you remove it from the supplier account, because X Limited is Jasmine's supplier. So you remove it from the supplier account, and at the same time you remove $500 from the customer account to bring that $750 down to $250. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking that $500 out. Notice that I would need to debit and credit both accounts with the same amount, and so therefore I'm going to use my $500 to offset, and I'm going to need to do it in both books, and therefore B is the only option that would be suitable here. The next question: a trader maintains a sales ledger control account. How can he calculate credit sales? Well, this would simply be that you're working out a missing amount. I always find it easiest to draw up a little T account to show me what is actually going on in this situation. So here I've drawn up a rough account for my sales control. In other words, the total or summary of all my customer accounts. Because customers owe me, my balance brought down would be on the debit side. It's an asset. And we would then also debit any sales. But we don't know what that figure is, and that's what you would try to work out. On the credit side of this account, you would show any entries in bank, in other words, any receipts from your customers where they settled amounts owing. And then you would work out the new balance, which would be brought down on the debit side, and therefore above the totals, it would be the carry down on the credit side. In other words, this is your new balance at the end of the month. In order to work out that missing figure there, hopefully you can see, because both of these sides need to be the same, we now don't need to look at the brought down because it's the same as the carry down. If you want to see what that missing amount is, you would add up these two figures and subtract that. So therefore, to work out your missing sales, you would take all your bank or receipts that you received, you would add your balance carried down, and you would subtract your balance brought down, and therefore the only option would be B. Number 12 from November 2015, paper 1-1. The trial balance of a business does not agree. The difference has been entered in a suspense account, a very common practice. Remember that basically the suspense account would then just have the amount that you would need to do as a correction. So if a suspense account has a debit balance, it means you need to debit an account somewhere. The error was caused by a check of $400 from Omar being debited to Omar's account. Which entries would correct this? Well, I always like to go back to my T accounts again, and I've created a T account for Omar's account. What I do is I show what did happen. The error was that his account was debited. We've been told that there was a check of $400 and it was debited. So we know that there's $400 on the debit side. You now need to think a little bit and realize that if there was a check from Omar, that means that he actually owes us less money. And if an asset is decreasing, then actually you should have a $400 on the credit side. Now when you look at this T account, it should be quite obvious to see that to get from a debit of $400 to a credit of $400, what you're going to have to do is a credit of $800 to correct this. In effect, what you're doing is you need to do one 400 to cancel out the mistake, and then another 400 to get the credit balance that you want. So that's why you have to double up the amount. So to credit 800, you need to then choose C as your option to credit Omar's account with 800. And then obviously you would debit the suspense account as the other side of that transaction. Number 10 from November 2015, paper 1-2. A sales return of $400 has been credited to the customer's account as $40. A suspense account is created to complete the trial balance. What is the balance on the suspense account? Remember, your suspense account will have the balance that you need to do to correct the error. So what you actually need to find out is, what do you need to do to correct the error on the customer's account? Should it be a debit or a credit, and how much? So if we have a look at the customer again, what I've done is, just like I did before, I have shown at the top what did happen. There was a return and it was entered as 40. However, it should have been entered as 400. So how do you get from 40 to 400 on the credit side? Obviously, there's a missing figure over here on the credit side, and you should easily be able to see that it would be a 360. So if you need to credit 360 in the customer account, your suspense account would have this credit 360 until it's fixed, and therefore your answer is going to be A. Number 12. A business provided the following information. Here you have detailed information about your purchases. What was the credit balance at the beginning, what you bought, what payments, what returns. And the question is, what is the balance on the purchases ledger control account at the 30th of April? You should be able to work this out pretty simply by realizing, obviously, it's the balance plus the purchases minus payments and returns. But if you're not 100% sure, draw up your T account for purchases control. Purchases control is a summary of all your suppliers or liabilities, and therefore it would have a credit balance. Your purchases would then also be credited, and you would need to debit your payments and your returns, because bank would be being credited because you're paying the amount and you owe your liability less, so that's why you're debiting it. For the returns, again, you are reducing the amount that you owe them. You can then very simply work out what that end balance should be, and you should get 21331. Once you've worked out your answer here, only then go and have a look at the options given. Obviously, if what you got is not one of the options, you know you've made a mistake. And if it does appear there, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are correct, but it is certainly a safer way of doing it. So in this case, we have got it as an option, and we are going to choose B as our answer. Moving on to question 14. Rachel's trial balance did not agree, and she placed the difference in a suspense account. The following shows how 4 errors have been corrected using the suspense account. So you can see that the difference originally was a debit of 200. Here were some errors where we debited the suspense account. In other words, you would have credited discount and credited cash, and similarly here you would have debited discount and debited the sundry expenses. The profit for the year before the errors were corrected was $35,400, and then the question is, what is the correct profit for the year? Again, I'm going to try and work it out before I look at the answers that are supplied. I'm obviously going to want to start with the incorrect profit, and then I'm going to look at all the corrections and see whether they would increase or decrease my profits. If we look at discount allowed over here, remember I said if we are debiting the suspense account, it means I'm crediting discount allowed. And if I'm going to credit my discount allowed, it means that my expense is actually decreasing. And if my expense is getting smaller, it means profit increases. So I would add 160. This cash amount of 340, remember that a cash correction is not actually going to affect profit at all, so we leave it out. Discount received, As we worked out for the discount allowed, discount received must be debited, and so therefore the income and the profit are decreasing. So I'm going to subtract 310. And similarly, sundry expenses are debited, so my expenses are increasing, and expenses get bigger, then the profit is getting smaller, so I will subtract 390, and that is how I would work out a correct profit of 34860. You now go and have a look at the options given to you, and you can see there C is an answer, and that is what you would choose. Number 15. A bank reconciliation statement has been prepared by an inexperienced bookkeeper. So you can see here it's been drawn up. The overdrawn bank statement balance has been given. Checks received not paid in are given, and checks paid to suppliers that haven't yet been presented, and the balance at the end. The question then says, what is the correct bank balance according to the cash book? Keep in mind that the cash book balance should equal the reconciled bank statement balance. In other words, the bank statement balance, add and subtract any outstanding deposits and payments that the bank is not yet aware of. So if we go back and have a look at this, there were outstanding checks that we were received, in other words, outstanding deposits, and outstanding checks or payments made. Those do need to go in, and you would add your deposits and you would subtract your receipts. So that is not incorrect in itself. And if we list them all over there, that's what it would look like. But it's pretty much exactly the same as is already given in the question. However, if you go and type these numbers into your calculator, you would see that if you're starting with a minus 68 and then you add 141, you're certainly not going to get a positive 209. And if you then subtract 41,800, you're certainly not going to get that amount at the end. So the problem here is that these two subtotals and end result are incorrect. If you simply start with the overdrawn balance, add your outstanding deposits, subtract your outstanding checks, you will get a favorable bank balance of 31,300. Let's go and have a look if that's an answer for us. And yes, it is. There it is as number B. So that is going to be our option that we choose. Number 16. An invoice for the purchases was credited to the purchaser's account. How is the balance on the purchaser's account corrected? Again, I'm not going to look at my answers until I've figured it out for myself. Let's just draw up a rough purchaser's expense T account. Now, you don't always have to draw up all these T accounts. It's just if you're at all a little bit confused, they are very, very useful. And I'm using them simply to illustrate my explanations to you. In the purchaser's expense account, it says that an invoice was credited. So that means that I've put my supplier as a credit on the purchaser's expense account. Okay, remember I always show my incorrect thing above the totals and then my balance at the bottom, what it should be. So if I'm looking at my purchaser's expense, if I'm buying stuff and I'm spending money, that means I owe the supplier. So actually the supplier should have been credited and hopefully was credited, but my purchases then needs to be debited because the expense must be debited to decrease equity and decrease profits. So therefore, if I had a credit and I need to have a debit, do you remember what we did previously? You actually have to do a debit here and it needs to be double the amount of the error, because once is to cancel out the mistake that was made, and then a second time is to create the answer that we actually want. So what you're going to look for is an answer that gives you an option to debit your purchaser's expense or increase your expense by double the amount. And therefore, we are going to choose D as the option. Increase it by twice the value of the invoice. Let's now go on to the Cambridge specimen paper number 1, question 5. Alfredo received his bank statement, which showed a balance of $937 overdrawn. This did not agree with his cash book. On investigation, he noted the following. Now, I'm actually not even going to read that yet. I want to go quickly see what is the question. At which value was the bank overdraft shown in the statement of financial position? In other words, what is the correct bank figure? Just as we did for the previous one, you need to realize that your cash book amount or financial statement figure amount should equal the reconciled bank statement. So we are going to start with a bank statement of 937 overdrawn that was given to us, and then we are going to look at these transactions and see what still needs to be taken into account by the bank. Bank charges of 76 had not been entered in the cash book. Well, yes. If we knew the beginning cash book balance, we could use that and try and work out a new amount. But we don't have that, so that's not actually going to be much use to us. So we are not going to use it in the reconciliation. We are not going to factor that into our calculations. There was an unpresented check paid to suppliers of $214. So if we made a payment that hasn't yet been cashed at the bank, we do need to show that as an unpresented payment, and we would subtract it from our bank statement balance. So that's why we're going to say minus 214. Alfredo had recorded $35 cash paid into his bank account, but this was not showing on the statement. So what has happened here is that there's an outstanding deposit of 35 that the bank still needs to take into account, and so therefore I'm going to add that, and I can now work out my cash book balance as 1116, and that is the amount that would need to be shown in the statement of financial position as an overdrawn figure. And fortunately it does say that it is an overdraft here. If we got a positive balance, we would need to go back and look at our calculations. Let's see if it's in the answers. There it is as C, and so that is what you are going to choose. Number 9. Discounts received reduce the amount owed. The purchaser's ledger control account has a closing balance of $15,300. Discounts received of $600 have been entered on the wrong side of the control account. What is the corrected balance? Again, I'm going to just do a T account to illustrate for you. Remember, the purchaser's control is a liability account. It's representing all my suppliers. Now, what happened is that the discounts of 600 were entered on the wrong side. Discounts should be debited to reduce the amount that is owed. But if it was put on the wrong side, it means that it was credited. Now, notice that for my quick little correction of error, I haven't actually put the closing balance in, simply because it would confuse me at this stage. All I want to do is find out what do I need to do to fix the mistake. So I show my error at the top, I show what it should be at the bottom, and just like those other ones that we looked at, we would need to debit purchases with $1,200. In other words, we want to decrease the amount owed by $1,200. So we can then do a calculation. We've worked out that the correction needs to be a debit $1,200, and to correct it, you now take your balance of $15,300 minus $1,200 to get an answer of $14,100. Look for that as an option, and you will now choose A. Let's look at question 4 of June 2016, paper 1-1. The total of trade payables balances in Conrad's purchases ledger was $57,400. The following errors were then discovered. The question asks, what is the correct total of trade payables balances? In other words, what do you need to do to fix the total over here? So this is what he worked out, but it was incorrect. So obviously we will start with that amount there, the incorrect amount in the purchaser's ledger. We then go and look at each of these amounts. The discount allowed was overcast in the cash book. Overcast simply means it was totaled, but it was totaled as too much. However, discount allowed doesn't relate to my purchases. It relates to my customers and would have gone to the sales ledger, and therefore it actually has no bearing on this question here. It has no effect. We will ignore it. Then returns outwards are omitted in a supplier's account of $350. If you forgot to record 350 in a supplier's account, that means that you actually owe 350 less, and you would need to record that as a deduction in the amounts owed. Payments to trade payables were undercast in the cash book. That means it was totaled, but the total that was calculated was 137 too little. So we need to then have an extra 137 payment. Again, a payment means that actually what's happened here is it's the total that we're busy looking at. Now, remember that would go to the control account and it would be in the cash book. Over here, however, remember that we are looking at the purchaser's ledger. We are not looking at the control account. We are looking at the total of the purchaser's ledger. And the individual accounts would have been posted on their own, individually day by day, not the total. So over here, we actually can ignore that 137. If we were showing a correction to the control account, we would have taken it into account. But this is not the case over here. And then lastly, the purchaser's journal was overcast. Again, because it's a total that has been overcast, it is not going to affect my purchaser's ledger, which illustrates my individual supplier accounts. And so therefore that has no effect. I can then work out the correct total by simply taking my beginning balance and subtracting the 350. I now look for a 57050, and I am going to choose D as my answer. Question 5. The debit balance on a company's sales ledger control account was $125,000. The following errors were then discovered. Number 1, a bad debt of $800 had not been entered in the sales ledger control account. Number 2, an increase in the provision for doubtful debts of $500 was required. And number 3, the sales journal had been overcast by $1,000. What was the total of the balances in the sales ledger? Similarly, this is now looking at the total in the sales ledger, but we've been given a control account balance. Keep in mind that the control account is a summary of all the individual accounts in my sales ledger, and they should actually agree, but we're going to have to adjust based on the errors that we discover. So we will start with my control account balance of $125,000. I will then add or subtract any errors in the control account to get my total sales ledger balances. The bad debt, if it was not entered in the sales ledger control account, obviously I'm going to need to subtract it, because if you've written it off as bad, it decreases the total amount owed that I'm keeping in my books, because I don't expect to get the money anymore. Where the provision for doubtful debts was required of $500, well, in fact, this over here is an entry that you would use to adjust your statement of financial position figure. You are not going to adjust your control account nor your individual sales ledger accounts, for the simple reason that it is an overall provision that is being made. You are not actually writing off any individual account. So we will ignore number 2. Number 3, the sales journal had been overcast. Now, last time when we spoke about journals being overcast, we said, oh, we can't use it, but that's because we were looking at the individual accounts. Over here, we are looking at the control account, and that sales journal would have been posted. So therefore, if the sales was overcast, in other words, too much was put into the control account, we then need to subtract R1,000 because they don't owe us as much as we thought they did. And you can then work out the sales ledger total, which should equal the corrected control account. Here we can see that 123,200 is an option if we choose B, and so that is the answer that we will use. Question 6. A business's suspense account appears as follows. So the suspense account, remember, is showing what we had to do to correct things. There was an opening balance of 100 on the credit side, so that means that our corrections needed to have an overall effect of a credit of 100. You can see here that on the credit side, I have sales 50, which means that my sales account must have been debited by 50. In other words, the sales were reduced by 50. And my discount allowed account, I would have had to credit 150. In other words, again, I would have reduced that expense. So, which statements are correct? Well, the total debits had been $100 less than the total credits in the trial balance. Okay, now that is going to be correct. Sorry, it's not going to be correct. Have a look here quickly at what we've worked out. We've worked out that our discount allowed had to be credited, and our sales would have been debited, and therefore your credits would have been smaller than the debits by $100. Okay. Over here it says the total debits had been $100 less than total credits. No, because we've already worked out the credits must have been smaller than the debits by $100, so 1 is not an option. Number 2, the sales account had been overcast by $50. Well, we had to reduce it, which means yes, it must have been overcast or entered as too much. So number 2 is certainly an option. Number 3, the discount allowed had been overcast by 150. Similarly, yes, because if you're crediting your discount allowed, it means you are decreasing your expense. So again, it must have been overcast. Therefore, we want the options of 2 and 3. So C is the answer that we will choose. Number 7, a bank statement shows a credit balance of $1,500. A payment of $500 and a receipt of $1,250 were included in the cash book, but have not yet appeared on the bank statement. Bank interest payable of $1,100 had been correctly recorded in the cash book, but due to a bank error had been recorded in the bank statement as $1,000. What is the cash book balance? As we did previously, if we can work out what the reconciled bank statement balance should be, that will give us our correct cash book. So let's start with the bank statement favorable of $1,500 as it was given. Then we are told that there's an outstanding payment of $500, so we will need to subtract that. And we are also told that there's an outstanding receipt of $1,250, so we would need to add that on. Now, for this one over here, there's a difference of 100 Rand. Because it tells us that it was due to a bank error, that means that it's not a correction that we have to make, but rather a correction that the bank needs to make. And the bank will need to subtract a further $100 from our account. And that is why I am showing correction of bank error as 100 in brackets. You can then work out your cash book balance as 2,150, and your answer is then C. And that then concludes